Hey everyone. I'd like to talk about ecstasy, consciousness, and the mind. This goes without saying, I hope, that this is all a part of mental health as well, and transcending the current paradigm of mental health and mental health treatment. I'm not here to prescribe you anything in particular, but I'm here as a point of reflection so that we can together go into the very fundamental physics of the mind, of thought, of the psyche, and take a look at it without any mystery, without any strange words or concepts that would otherwise cloud what is essentially a very easy thing to see. So, I'd like to start out with the fundamental fact that as a human being, therefore as consciousness, you have the capacity to perceive thought. You don't need anybody else to tell you what thought is or how it works, as if it's some mysterious force beyond your capacity to comprehend. So, thought is very, very easy to understand. It's very, very easy to see. And the price that one must pay to be able to understand it is the willingness to step aside from one's personal identification with it. As long as there is any semblance of personal identification with any thought forms whatsoever, and that includes with memory, then there is not sufficient distance between you, what you really are, in your direct experience, and the forms of thought, which is simply to say thought itself, in order to be able to perceive it in the raw and therefore see what it is. And what we call mental illness, whether depression, anxiety, all the way to schizophrenia and so on and so forth, only have the capacity to manifest as distressing diseases and illnesses because of an improper relationship with thought and memory. Ignorance, which is not a bad word, but ignorance of the very nature of thought, ignorance of the very nature of memory, can only lead to an incorrect relationship with the field of thought, and looking at it very simply and carefully, but simply, the entire civilizational structure which we live in is built upon an incorrect relationship with thought. So from the time that you're small and stretching throughout the entire span of your life, all of the systems and the institutions in which you find yourself participating, be that family, be that friendships, be that academia, religious institutions, even scientific institutions, entertainment institutions, extracurriculars, doesn't matter. The entire social structure, in all ways, is based upon, built upon, a very fundamentally flawed perception, a skewed, a distorted perception of the very faculty of thought itself. And so, naturally, the entire civilizational structure within which we find ourselves breeds what we call mental illness, disorder. So, the only way to come back to the raw nature of oneself, which is clearly, if you were ever a child once, and if you're watching this, you were, when you were a child, after the initial traumatic incident, which may have led to another and another and another and another, the faculties become more and more constricted, more and more ill at ease, and there's much less of a capacity to flow, to be open to what is as it comes, and to release when something's done. So when you were born, up until whatever age, right, you weren't suffering from all of these maladies. They began to express themselves later. So what happened? What fundamental superstition must have been absorbed for all of this internal disorder and disease and dissatisfaction to take root? The fundamental superstition that we have of thought and memory in our culture, in our society, in our world, is that you are that token of thought and memory. There's an expectation that you have a psychological image of yourself with all of its composite parts. And everybody around you has one, and your primary relationship with people ends up, especially after about the age of, 5, 6, 7, right around there, your relationships with the people around you become relationships between your images, which is an ego. That's what ego is. Ego doesn't just mean aggression or pomp. Your ego is your image of yourself, which is constructed of thought and memory. And obviously that's not you. It's not real. But that token, that avatar, is how we're expected to interact and interface in the world. Well, that can only lead to poor mental health. It leads to the degradation of the human being. It must. Because it puts consciousness in a very, very small psychological framework, which is not conducive to its being in its natural state. It's just like the earth itself. Naturally, she has her forests and her lakes and her rivers and her oceans and her mountains and all of the natural features, and the human beings as well as the animals that roam upon the earth. They have their natural migratory flow, moving from this place to this place, and that includes the insects and the birds and everything. And when everything is simply allowed to flow the way that it's naturally predisposed to flow, the entire system functions harmoniously and is in very good health. The minute that human beings begin interfering with the landscape and damming off the rivers and using the lakes and the oceans as a dump, a trash dump, and creating walls, artificial borders, disallowing so many groups of animals as well as human beings from making the necessary migratory marches that keep the ecosystems in a healthy, natural state of balance, poisoning the soil, disrupting insect life, not allowing animals to also do their business, to defecate, right, in the soil, not allowing death to be there in the soil, not allowing nature to run its course intelligently, as it always has, then the natural systems, the ecosystems, which are essentially the capillaries, the blood vessels, the oxygen, everything that the planet needs, just like the body. If you begin pinching off arteries, if you deprive the body of necessary nutrients, what happens? It withers, it shrivels, it decays, it gets ill. And so similarly, just as we have built our structures upon the planet in ignorance of the natural flow of all the moving parts of the earth, which has resulted in a degradation of life on the planet. So our ignorance of our own psyche, which is itself an illusion, but our ignorance of the nature of thought itself and memory and how it functions is what has led us, and is obviously no different than our ignorance of the way that the planet functions in harmonious relationship to itself, has resulted in our illness, has resulted in our disease. So, ultimately, there's no way out of mental malady without the direct realization of the nature of the mind itself. There's no other way. Anything else is a concession, which will always come back in another brutal relapse into distress, mental illness, and disorder, however long the temporary effect of any kind of medication or a change in the outer world temporarily will produce. Because anyway, without the physical state of our survival as human beings on this planet being secured civilizationally, there will always be cause for woe, despair, grief, anguish. So, if we see then that our outer disorder is a reflection of our inner disorder, of our fear, of our greed, then it's obvious that the only thing to do, first and foremost, is to turn inward and to look at the very nature of thought itself, why it operates the way it does, and to see then the relationship between thought and ignorance, between knowledge, what we call knowledge, and ignorance. Because all of our knowledge, our technological knowledge, which we have imposed upon the earth and its natural processes, and which we have imposed upon ourselves as human beings and our natural processes, has resulted in an incredible calamity, an incredibly disastrous state of living. And we are aware of this, and yet we still praise the knowledge. But the knowledge always goes with ignorance. It's not total knowledge, it's not full knowledge, it's not complete knowledge. And so without awareness of where we're walking, we're implementing technologies and making certain moves that have, in the practical course of time, revealed themselves over and over and over again to have been the wrong moves. Wrong in the sense of incorrect, in terms of precision of desired outcome. With our knowledge and our faculties of knowledge, we've more often harmed ourselves in the name of short-term beneficial gain. And despite the fact that our short-sightedness has caused us to shoot ourselves in the feet over and over and over again, we continue to move in the same direction, using the same faculties in the same way, doing the same thing, expecting different results. And if you look at the world, and if you look at yourself, still in the same place you always were, if not a little worse for wear, then what is the sanity, I'm asking, in assuming that anything is going to change if you continue to do the same thing? Using chemicals to superficially correct what is really, truly, deeply only correctable by removing a cause at its root is never going to work. It's very wonderful that we have ocean cleanup crews and certain inventors developing technologies that are meant to go out and sweep the ocean of plastics and so on. But if the cumulative work is that those technologies are only capable of removing, let's say, 10,000 tons of trash a day from the oceans, while 100,000 tons are being dumped into the oceans every day, and not just today, but for the past, 50, 60, 70 to 100 years. It may not have been 100 tons initially, but that's what it's worked up to, and certainly for the last 70 years or so, it's been a tremendous amount. And so, more than simply sending a cleanup crew into the oceans and so on to clean up whatever little they can every day, one must, at the same time, stop dumping the toxic chemicals and the plastics and the poisons and so on into the oceans simultaneously. And so, in the same way, it doesn't do one any good to take medication for depression, anxiety, and try to artificially engineer an external environment in which there are no triggers and no bothers and no points of agitation and irritation, if one is simultaneously not willing to go inward and discover the root in thought and memory of the illness itself. And so when one does this, one sees that the root of depression, the root of anxiety, is false belief, incorrect belief. If you do not cling to any structure of thought and memory, which brings about comparison, what something was, what it's going to be, what it should be, what it shouldn't be, what this one is, what somebody else's is, right? Comparison, which comes about by having a structure of thought which is sustained through time, that is your belief system, your belief structure about who you are, about what the world is, and therefore projections about where it's going or where it might go or where it might not go, which comes along with comparing yourself in all ways to the people next to you. This state of mind can only bring about depression and anxiety, dread, worry, and all manner of mental malady. So that the only cure, really, not only for what's going on inside of us, but what's going on outside of us, apparently, right, in the world, as the ecological degradation, the civilizational degradation of the world, which is not merely something new. Our technology has sped it up quite substantially over the past, 100 years or so. But it's not a different problem than what we've been facing really since the beginning of civilization itself. And the very solution for this is what has been called shamanic ecstasies in a Western anthropological sense. It would be nice if we had words for this in English. There are words for it in many other languages, and unfortunately because of that, and even in our grandparental languages, the languages that preceded modern English, which were rooted in cultures that were very much aware of the inner technologies of consciousness, there were words for the primordial ecstasy, the primordial state of intelligent, ecstatic bliss that is the very core and root nature of not just the human being, but of all life, which the human being, as the human vessel, has a very specialized capacity to be aware of, to know, and to express. These inner technologies of awareness, of consciousness, have been lost to us, and in fact, they seem to be, according to standards of our modern culture, either non-existent or impossible, simply by virtue of not being aware of what one is to even consider it. So, I'm asking you, anyway, to simply see the fact that if anything at all, is going to be handled well and responsibly, then it must be seen. If you're holding a knife and you're unaware of the dimensions of the knife, and yet you run around swinging it or using it, you will eventually hurt yourself and hurt everybody and everything around you. So the only way to use a tool properly is to be aware of its dimensions and to be willing to learn what it is, not to conclude that you know what it is and go on using it, taking it for granted, while continuing to inflict pain and suffering, and then continuing to convince yourself that you understand it, right? And so it is with thought. Without being aware of the dimension of thought, the depth and dimension of thought, its shape, its form, its capacity, and its limitation, we wield it rather brazenly. Apparently unaware of the consequences thereof, and then wondering why we're in the situations that we're in. Thought being the most basic tool of consciousness, the most fundamental tool that we have, the tool which is the basis of all other tools, and yet one learns how to handle the products of thought with deftness, whether it's something as simple as a knife or something as complex as a computer, a supercomputer, in all of its forms. We learn how to handle those technologies. Most people don't handle them optimally necessarily, but a lot of people do. And yet the very technology, which is the source of all technologies, which is thought itself, we don't even take the time to understand, and we think furthermore, we have a superstition that it's impossible to understand such technology as thought. And so we leave that job to whether the philosophers, or the so-called philosophers, or the psychologists, or whomever. It becomes irrelevant. But there's that fundamental superstition that says that thought cannot be understood, it's too mysterious, it's too vague, it's too vast, and these are all assumptions. These are all assumptions that have never been checked. You have not checked them. You simply look at the way that thought has become to operate in you and say, well, it seems very complicated. It comes from nowhere. It returns to nowhere. It says things that I like. It says things that I don't like. And along with thought, because thought and emotion are one, and so with all of the disturbances in thought that take place in the psychic sphere, there comes all the emotional disturbances accompanying it, because if there's mental, there's emotional disturbance. It's the same thing. And because that disturbance we experience as being painful or irritating or agitating, and then the body and its chemical system, its limbic system, its hormonal system get given over to that, its adrenal system get given over to the undulation, the fluctuation of thought and emotion, which bring the body on its roller coaster ride. And because the experience then of thought and emotion and the body together as a single unit becomes so distressing and so real in our experience, rather than take a step back and observe it, look at it, see what it is, see what's really going on, we say this is too much, this is overpowering, it's overwhelming, I don't know what to do about it. And when I talk about it, nobody else seems to know what to do about it. And they simply further exacerbate it, because the more questions you ask about it, or I ask about it, or whoever asks about it, we're one here inquiring together. As soon as there's any kind of questioning about it to the people around who don't know you're met either with indifference or agitation, or sometimes a very profound anger and resistance and resentment and on and on. So then, obviously, what it takes to find out the nature of thought, one has to do it alone, unless one is inquiring with somebody who is just as serious. So one, you have to see something, that it takes a total seriousness. That means one has to have absolutely no desire to deceive oneself in order to be able to do this inquiry, to look into the nature of thought. If you have even the slightest bit of desire to fool yourself, to trick yourself, to deceive yourself, which means to continue following the same old course you've been following, the one that brings suffering and the internalized violence and the perpetuation of trauma inwardly and therefore outwardly, which is a very addictive pattern because it's a groove. It's a groove that runs in cycles, and so it's addictive. It's very easy to simply give oneself over to the following of that track. And this is called unconsciousness. It's a partial release. It's not a full release. It's a partial release. It's a saying, well, there's a groove here, there's a track here, so let me simply go along with it. Because then I can throw my attention partially out here and out there and out there and out there and there and there and there and there and there, while this thing is apparently taking care of itself, even though I don't like the ride, even though it's a terribly painful, awful, bloody ride, I'm still going to. Because what else to do? And it becomes obvious that the only thing to do is to stop. To stop and to look, to listen. And that requires inwardly being totally alone. Which doesn't mean making a declaration of sorts of, living a life in solitude permanently or isolation permanently, but it may mean that you physically have to go and sit off by yourself for a while, and you ought to anyway, at least for a few days. Be by yourself without anybody. But inwardly, you have to see that the only way to pierce that veil of thought, of all the structures created by thought, is to simply be alone. To inwardly be alone. Which means what? You have to inquire into the origin of thought. And most people won't want to. Because even though they complain about their suffering and their strife, to actually go down to the root of it, which would mean to remove all of that suffering and strife, which is clearly the byproduct of the accumulation of thought improperly believed in, means that one can no longer go on living the way one is living. And even though one, on the one hand, wants to find a new way of living, one wants to find a new way of living that doesn't inconvenience the old way of living. And there's no sense there. Because obviously a new way of living implies a total, something completely different from the old. There can be no trace of the old there. Otherwise, there's a seed which is simply going to resprout itself. And so the whole old root, the whole old world, psychologically, has to be completely rooted out. Which means that just like the characters in all of the old so-called folkloric and mythological stories, and those are all roadmaps, those are all guideposts for you, you have to be willing to leave everything you know and love, or think you love, everything you're attached to. You must leave everything you know, which means everything you're attached to, behind. Whether physically or inwardly, but you can do it physically without doing it inwardly. And so really what matters more than anything is that it's done inwardly. Whether it's done physically or not makes no difference. It may end up being done physically, but it must happen inwardly. And so what does that mean? You see that all of your identities, your beliefs about yourself, who you are, who other people are, what your relation to them is, what your relation to the world is, what the world's relation to you, all of it. Every single image, every single concept, every single notion, every single ideology, every single belief and disbelief, etc., 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 ad infinitum, all of it that you have that is built upon within the mind as thought and memory. All of the structures of thought and memory built within the mind have to be abandoned. A veritable shaking of the Etch-a-Sketch. And so are you willing to do that? Because if you see that your very definition of yourself as something separate, something apart from others and the rest of the world, that very basic identification of yourself as something separate, individual, apart from, that is the root of mental malady. That is the very root of depression. That is the very root of anxiety. That is the root. And there's no way to sustain that definition of oneself and not be anxious and depressed without finding some, what are called coping mechanisms, which means some way to numb yourself, some way to ignore the fact of the root problem itself, which one doesn't want to do anything about, or is too frightened to look at, or thinks one can't do anything about. But now here comes the point of departure, because this is where one must make a choice. Do you choose wholeness or fragmentation? And choosing wholeness means then seeing that not only the society in which you live, but all your relations and the people around you, see how they choose fragmentation, because it furthers the ends of greed, or lust, or wrath. It furthers the agenda of fragmentation, which is seeking short-term pleasure, avoiding pain, short-term, which only ends up bringing about long-term pain and very little pleasure. But this is the whole movement of conditioned thought, of fragmented thought, which is the very basis of our civilizational and social structure, including our religious structure, our scientific structure, our academic structure, our governmental structure, our entertainment structure. All of it is based on short-sighted pleasure at the danger of ignoring actual long-term consequences out of ignorance and the desire to keep moving ahead, even though one doesn't know where one's going or what the consequences will be. And so one is following, basically, the whole structure of fragmented thought is following a predetermined track. And so if you simply stop and look, you can see exactly where it's going. But in following the predetermined track, wherever one is on that track presently, one decides not to look ahead, pretending that, well, we can't really see where we're going anyway, right? Because the future is unknown. The future is only unknown if you live in the unknown presently. But if you live in the known as the known presently, then the future is known. Because when you live in the known, that is on the track, which is the only possible way of living psychologically, and therefore technologically, when you are living from fragmented thought, from the so-called individual, which is separate, right? When you're living from that, you're living out a predetermined pattern, which means you're living robotically, you're living mechanically, and you're going around a predetermined track. And so to be on a predetermined track and yet to cover your eyes and pretend that you can't know where the track is going is a form of self-deception. And it's that very self-deception which has landed us in the situation in which we find ourselves. Not only what you would call personally, but collectively, because it's the same thing. The state of the person is the state of the collective. The state of the collective is the state of the person. And so to transcend that, to use that word, means then to get off the track. And one cannot get off the track as long as one is addicted to the track, attached to the track. And the addiction to the track is the addiction to form, the addiction to thought structure sustained through time, which we call memory, and the reinterpretation of memory, the re-concretization, the re-solidification of memory and its forms, over and over and over again, which can only move cyclically. And yet we pretend it's going in a straight line. But that's our deliberate ignorance and our deliberate lack of desire to face it, to see that we're going in circles, because we want to believe that we're going somewhere else, you see? And so there's always deliberate self-deception in thought, in believing and clinging to consistent structures of thought through time as personal identity. It's deliberate self-deception, and it can only lead to depression, anxiety, violence, self-destruction, and every other mental malady stems from that. You know, those so-called treatable ones anyway, right? There may be situations of someone sustaining physical brain damage and something, happening in there. But even if there's no memory, then there's very little risk of something happening in that regard. So when it comes to all of the illnesses that we deal with, that we blame on we say it's the environment, it's my genetics, it's this and that or the other, right? None of those things can be as they are without the improper relationship, the improper perception of thought and memory. But that's egged on by the society. The very structures in which we live, the economic structures, the social structures, the academic structures, the entertainment, the religious, the scientific, the artistic, even the so-called, because even though true art, true science, true religion, and true technology are one. But we live in a fragmented world created by thought, and so these things which are fundamentally one are treated as separate fragments, and therefore they're all running in different directions, but really therefore running in the same direction. Because even our artistic institutions are simply now become institutions of repetition, and therefore of cyclical production and movement like everything else. And so obviously true religion, true art, true science is not that. It's really a liberation from that. But we live with false art, false religion, false science. And so it's used simply for short-term personal gratification and personal entertainment at the expense of actual clarity of perception, of the direction in which the cyclical track is taking us, and therefore a lot of feigned ignorance, deliberate ignorance and feigned ignorance. And yet our ignorance is championed as knowledge. So if one is willing to disabuse oneself of these false notions and awarenesses, obviously that can't be done unless you're willing to sit alone and do the work yourself. Because no one else is going to really do it with you. Now, you may find some people who are interested in inquiry, but finally to walk through the door, the final door yourself, means to walk through as the bare nakedness of your own being. To walk through as the bare soul, without any notion, without any thought, without any identity or idea about who and what you are, where you're going, where you've been, to completely go beyond all thought and all memory and all ideation. Which means there's nothing and no one there, not even yourself, in the way that you understand yourself, know yourself as a psychological object. That must be completely gone. So to walk through the final doorway, if you will, the gateway into consciousness, means you have to go through as nothing and no one. Which means you can't take anyone with you, not even yourself. Everyone must go alone. And in that aloneness, there is total union. Because there are no others then. There is no separation. When there's no thought, when there's no memory, there's no separation. And memory will anyway be there. You see, that's what you have to find out. When you make that distance between yourself and thought, and you see that you cannot, thought and memory are simply there, like the elements. And they take care of themselves. You don't have to cling to any particular shape, image, or form of thought and memory, and declare that one to be yours, and another to be somebody else's. See, there's no sense in that. But that nonsense right there, and the belief in that, and therefore the attempt to make thought permanent, and thought by its nature, the structures of thought, which is just like sand on a beach in which you make sand castles and other structures, it's not permanent. The very physical nature of sand castles is that they're meant to fall down. And the very nature of all structures built of thought is that they're meant to fall down. And then you can simply use thought once again to make another structure, let it fall, build another structure, and let it fall. That's its nature. But when you try to make a sandcastle something permanent, the only thing that can result from that is your insanity. Especially if you believe it ought to be permanent, or it should be permanent, or there's something wrong if it's not permanent. And so the whole of the society is that you must make some structure that represents you, built of thought, so that everybody can identify it and recognize it. And it must be maintained consistently throughout your life, or throughout the duration of this career or that career or so on. And the amount of energy and time that it takes to maintain the psychological image, the image made of thought, which is an idol, is a religion in its own right, a religion in the sense of your daily practice. And so you cannot sustain a particular image of yourself or of the world or of anybody and anything without practice, and therefore without divided attention, and therefore without a terrible wastage of energy. And the moment that you stop tending to the structures built of thought, they begin to collapse and corrode. Anyway, they're collapsing and corroding. And so the more you tend to them, the faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster you have to run around them, patching and prodding and sealing and doing all of that. But the more you patch and seal, the more another hole in the seam rips somewhere else, you see? And so if you actually stop that insane activity, then the whole structure of thought collapses. And one feels that if one allows that to happen, that one is dying. And that is the experience that has to be gone through. Because when you see that that thought, which you have identified with, is not you, and that it's anyway always crumbling and collapsing, you try to keep it from collapsing, because to allow it to collapse would feel like death. And part of that is feeling that everything you've learned, everything you've earned, everything you've gained will be lost. And anyway, it ultimately will all be lost anyway. And you have to allow it to go. Otherwise, you keep running around, trying to keep it up. And then you have no hope of ever not being depressed and anxious and suicidal and everything else. Violent, inwardly, outwardly. So, if you see anyway, and so that's why, sometimes the leap into the unknown is called the leap of faith, the quantum leap, right? The leap of faith. Because making the leap is taking the risk that you will lose everything. But you have to most people don't do it until they get to that point where they're about to die, where they're about to, take their own bodies out of the equation. Because they don't know what else to do. Well, if you're at that door anyway, if you're at that threshold of taking your own self out, then you might as well simply leave the body alone and take the inner leap into the unknown. If you're going to go out anyway, you might as well first find out what it is to go out before going out. That is, take that leap inwardly into the unknown. If you're going to walk away from everything physically anyway, might as well just leave the physical alone and simply do it inwardly. Allow all the mental structures, the whole mental construct of a world or worlds that you've built to just go. And that means trust. It means trusting memory to do its job. Memory is memory precisely because it doesn't have to be tended to in that way. It does its job, right? And so if you actually trust your brain, and people say that they trust what we call science, but then they don't actually put that trust into practice, because memory is memory. It does what it does. You don't have to do anything about it. If you stop trying to control it and simply let it do what it does, then you don't have to worry about trying to keep it up. And if you let everything go, if you let those structures of thought go, actually let them go, one, it's a great relief. It's the ultimate relief. It's the burden of burdens being let off of one's chest, off of one's shoulders. You're no longer carrying anything anymore. And what you have to see in that upsets a lot of people if they begin to see it before they actually do it, is you see that you never did have to carry that burden around anyway. That all the suffering that you've been carrying and enduring upon your head for however long you've been doing it, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, has really basically been for naught. You never had to. You did it because you believed a lie. You did it because you believed a superstition. And a lot of people, it makes them feel pretty foolish. Which is a good thing if you can embrace that. See, whoa, I've been a fool. And this whole world has been operating in foolishness. And yet we all think ourselves so intelligent and smart and clever and scientifically disposed. And in fact, we're just a bunch of clowns. We're a lot of fools walking around pretending to be smart. Because the way out of all of our woes and trouble and problem has always been right here. Not just in front of us, but within us. And there was no reason for us to go around suffering like this. We did it because we were superstitious. And if you simply allow that to be as it is, it's the most humbling thing. And that very humility is learning. It allows one to learn about thought and therefore about what's beyond thought. It allows one to learn about oneself, what you actually are. Because when the structure of thought is gone, and you allow it all to just wash back into its source, which doesn't mean it's gone forever. Thought, as long as the body is alive, there will be thought. Thought's here. It's an element. You make something from it, you let it go. The problem is that you made an image from thought, and then you want to cling to it and make it permanent. This is my image. No, it's not. It's an image. Let it go. And then you can make as many as you want whenever you want, and then let them all go and do it again, and let them go and do it again and let them go. And that's the only way to stay sane and fresh and vital. Anything else is insanity. And so when you see that the whole structure of our way of relating to one another and to life on this planet is totally insane, not as a judgment or a condemnation, but just as a fact. It's based upon an erroneous understanding of the nature of thought. And thought is the simplest thing to understand. You don't need a bunch of degrees from any university to understand thought. Thought is the easiest thing to see and understand. But you have to allow yourself to see it. And when you do, you see, whoa, I did that. I believed in the dream. I believed in the lie. I believed in the superstition. And I gave myself to it, and so I suffered. And we're all here suffering because of the superstitions that we believe in. Period. It's that simple. And it's that hard. Not hard, it's that complex. And I only say that as a kind of concession because it's really not complex at all. If you look at what thought can do, it becomes rather complex in its movement, but it's the same basic simple structure which breeds so many varieties of apparent complexity. And if you understand the very basic fundamental nature aspect of thought, then the whole thing reveals itself, and you see how silly it all is. And then you have, you laugh, you cry, but then you can simply sit here and breathe and be free, openly. And so, when you allow the structures of thought to go, what you're left with is the fact that you are behind thought, beyond thought, before thought, and even during thought's presence. You are. And even when all thought and memory are put aside, here you are, in open, vast, undefined, radiant awareness. There's just the open field that has no beginning and no end. It's neither dark nor light, and yet it's dark and light at the same time. And it's beyond being either, both, or neither. It's just, here it is. And it is an intelligence. And what is simply left when thought is put down is the intelligence that's simply here. The intelligence of being, the intelligence of life, without beginning or end, without birth or death. And what is born and what dies is what is made of thought. And so which is all impermanent. And our insanity, our very angst, our anxiety and depression is in the fact that we cannot make what is impermanent permanent. And our whole civilizational goal up to this point, our mission statement, if you will, is to try to make the impermanent permanent. You can never make this mortal body immortal. You can never make anything of form can never be made immortal, permanent, in that particular state of form. All form comes and goes. All form has beginning and end. All what you call matter, physical form, and that includes all thought, because thought is physical form. Thought and thought structures obey the laws of physics. Gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, and that mysterious fifth force that physicists have yet to agree upon a name to. So, when you simply allow yourself to see thought as it is, then you see it's there, it's a toy. It's not to be taken seriously. It's not to be exalted and held up as the crowning jewel of humanity. It's not. It's our most simple play toy. The crowning jewel of humanity is our very consciousness. And our capacity as human beings with our prefrontal cortexes to be aware for consciousness through the human body, to be aware of itself, for consciousness to know that it knows that it knows. There's to be conscious of consciousness. For the eternal to look into a mirror and see the eternal. You know, when you take two mirrors and put them together like this and infinity opens up, well, you as the body always standing to the side of the mirror can never actually, you always see the end of it, right? Well, the two mirrors facing each other perfectly don't see the end of it. It's simply eternity, it's infinity right there. Well, that's your actual state. Boom, that's you. And as the human being, you have the capacity, your brain is basically two mirrors facing each other. The problem with us is our mirrors are askance, and they're all facing each other's mirrors, and so there's the appearance of great monsters and movements and all kinds of creatures and creations and that look like objects in the mirror that we all get hooked on and infatuated with or frightened of. But the reality is, if everyone simply straightens their, not everyone has to, we all do eventually, but if you simply straighten your mirrors out and face them toward one another, they're not facing out toward anything else, they're just facing each other perfectly, boom, you're clear into infinity. And that's the capacity of the human system. The human brain has that ability. The human heart, the whole human system has that capacity. Straighten the mirrors out, clean them, straighten the mirrors out, boom, right there. But as long as everybody's mirrors are askance and facing everybody else's mirrors, then you have this collective delusion, this collective, everyone's like, look at this, look at that, and everyone looks at something and they all think, everyone's looking at the same thing, but it looks different to everybody, right? And everyone's going, no, it's this, no, it's that, and some are afraid, and some are, enthused, enthralled, but then they go toward it and they end up getting destroyed, right? Or destroying somebody else on the way to their illusion. Either way, it's an illusion. Every object that appears in the mirror of the mind is an illusion. And it's all a collective thing. It's one illusion, but everyone's mirrors are facing each other, and so everyone thinks they have their own set of illusions and their own set of thoughts and their own set of... It's the askance positioning of all of the mirrors of the mind and the individual brains. And so when you simply take your mirrors and you put them back like this, and not stand from the angle or from the side, just right here. Boom. You look into infinity. And when you have that moment of gazing into the infinite within yourself, you're free. You're free of having to believe in the reality of those thought forms because they're not real. And thought is meant to be used as a tool. You turn it into a structure. It's an image. It's an image-making machine. And so you make a structure out of thought, which must obey the laws of physics. It's thought, otherwise the structure can't stand unless you artificially prop it up, and that requires, again, some knowledge of physics, but then eventually it all comes crumbling down anyway. And so a structure that's not stable won't last. And so, anyway, thought is meant to be used, then one sees as a tool for ensuring our survival, which has no meaning unless it ensures all of our survival. And so it must be used to secure, then, housing, food, water, education, healthcare, means of economical transaction, money as we call it, and utilities, right? Which include today data and internet and all of that. And so those survival situations are what we have thought for, and our development of technology is to facilitate more streamlined survival. But if survival remains a competition, trying to survive better, this nation better than this nation, this group better than this group, then what happens is no survival will result from that. It's just violence and chaos and warfare, and ignorance of thought. And so anyway, trying to survive better than one in any form, whether this religion, this country, that country, and all the rest of it, this group and that group, can only result from there being an image of oneself as being separate from the other, and so there's thought misplaced once again. And so the only proper use of thought, as the basic instrument that it is to ensure survival for the whole system, for the whole planet. And that can't be done if thought is being misused, being used to divide people from people, self from other. And that very division of self from other is the result of depression, anxiety, violence, hatred, warfare, greed, all the rest of it. All of the so-called problems that we'd like to say, well, let's figure out how to get rid of that. Well, you can't until you let go of your thought structures, until you see the nature of thought. And the moment you see the nature of thought, and therefore the limitations of thought, you see what's beyond thought. You see right into the infinite, which the human being has the capacity to perceive the eternal, to perceive the infinite. And yet, everybody, a lot of people anyway, would like to philosophize or suspect that that's not possible. Well, if it weren't possible, there'd be no point in being human. That is the glory of being human. And it's not something that's difficult or challenging or hard. You just have to be willing to die for it. You have to be willing to go through that experience of death. You have to be willing to go through that experience inwardly of losing everything, of having everything taken away. Because everything that you lose and everything that's taken away isn't really everything, but to you it's everything, because you're stuck in the limitation. And so to go beyond the limitation of who you thought you were, who you've been raised to think you are, who everybody around you reflects back to you that you are, and who you and your distorted perception of self reinterpret and reinvent and reinterpret yourself to be, based on all manner of feedback, internal and external, to see that none of that could ever be true. And so when you see that everyone's walking around in a great illusion, including you, there's a great collective illusion that we inhabit, called the dream, or there's so many names for it, there's so many names for it. But it's an illusion that's based on thought, and an erroneous use of thought. And so the evolution of the human being is coming to see that thought has to be used properly. And so thought is working itself out, basically. Thought has to be here. There's no two ways about it. But when thought is misapplied, when its nature isn't seen, then it begins moving in its own ways, according to its own predetermined patterns. But when thought is brought into consciousness completely in the human being, then its nature is seen, and vigilance is maintained, or vigilance is present, and therefore there's no more possibility for thought to be used inappropriately or incorrectly, which is making idols of one's, making images. Thought is a tool of technology. It divides, and so thought is necessary to build houses, to build roads, to create modes of transportation. It's necessary to weave textiles, right? It's necessary for agriculture. It's necessary for all these things of survival that we as human beings have to facilitate the existence of our bodies on the planet. But beyond that, when you start making images of who you are and who somebody else is and what the world is and what God is and what the consciousness is and what nothingness is, the minute you begin making images of something using thought, the image is untrue. And if you believe the image, you fall into all manner of violence and mental malady, which is our current state of being on the planet. And so this current phase in our evolution is not going to be in our bodies and the physicality, but where we're at right now, moving beyond the old paradigms, moving beyond the old constructs, is just this, coming into direct awareness of what thought is, of what memory is, of what thought is, and therefore perceiving the infinite. When thought's out of the way, which is always finite and limited, there's the infinite, there's the eternal, everywhere you look. It's right here. There's no getting around it. There's no getting away from it. It holds everything. You can't escape it. And so it's only coming back home, and this is the natural state. So it's only in coming back home to the natural state that you can actually, that there's any hope of one's survival for the human race at all in any meaningful way. But for all the mental maladies to go, to be on their way to disappear, and for there to be any hope, to use that word hope, for there to be any possibility of the, not just the survival, but the cleaning up of and the expansion of human beings as we are in a meaningful, conscious way upon this planet. Otherwise, we will simply continue to act out of the mechanical, robotic, pre-described, predestined, if you will, nature of cyclical thought patterns in the field of consciousness. Because thought moves in its predetermined patterns. And if you see where it's come from, you see where it's going. And it's not going anywhere good for us. We see that. And so you don't correct thought with better thought. That's the mistaken notion. You stop using thought, you look at what is the way it is, and then you use the tool of thought in subservience to consciousness itself, to direct awareness itself. If you try to use thought to conquer nature, you will not only lose, but you create disharmony and discord. Thought is meant to be used in harmony with the flow of nature and life, not against it. And the superstition is that if you use thought against nature, against life, to combat it, to conquer it, that you'll somehow conquer death. And you will not. That brings about death, much more imminently and quickly. But if you use thought in harmony with nature, then you have the capacity to sit here without being in internal resistance and conflict with yourself or anything. And therefore to perceive that which is already eternal, that which is already deathless, that which is already infinite, that which is already immortal, which is seen to be the truth of who you are, the true self, the true beingness of this whole cosmos, which is intelligence itself, which is peace, which is love, which is ecstasy. And then the real greatness begins. The real journey of being human begins. It's not the end, it's the beginning. But it's beyond even a beginning and an end. It's just, but within it there's infinite possibility of expansion, and just without the need to conquer and destroy and brutalize and be violent and destroy ourselves in the process. And when you touch it for yourself and come into it for yourself, it seems too good to be true. It's because it's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win-win. And it's like, this shouldn't be possible, but it's the only possibility. And, when you see, whoa, we are quite phenomenal. Being, life, consciousness, truth, love, peace, grace, glory is quite phenomenal. And it's nothing that thought has ever said it is. It's nothing that thought could ever say it is. It is what it is, and it can be known directly by every human being. And it can only be known when thought is put aside, when the truth of thought is seen, the fact of the nature of thought itself as a mechanism, as a tool, is seen. And then one can sit here and speak or not speak at all. You can do or not do, because what you don't do will be well, and what you do will be well. This is the basis of harmony. This is the basis of cooperation. And in it, one wants one thing and one thing only. Really, there's no particular kind of wanting. There's no direction. But in it, one wants, really, the desire is for everybody to know this. For all human beings to be aware directly of the truth of who and what they really are. And to see then that we've been living a lie. We've been living in a state of reversal for so long. And that the kind of action that we've been taking in the world has really been a kind of inaction in disguise as action. And that the kind of true action that must be taken sometimes looks like inaction. Sitting quietly, not introspecting necessarily, or you can say reflecting or introspecting, but really inquiring deeply. That means looking and discovering inwardly what you are, which means learning, the willingness to learn, which doesn't mean absorbing a new fact, which just gets added onto the same old track of psychological, predetermined, mechanical movement. But learning, true learning, actually means a total transformation of the brain structure of oneself. Total transformation is what's implied by learning. When there's actual learning, wherein one sees what is true and what is false, then one rids oneself of the false. One rids oneself of the mechanical structure. Because one sees that to keep any aspect of the false, to keep any aspect of the mechanical structure within oneself psychologically, cerebrally, can only bring about more destruction, violence, misery, brutality, all the things that have gotten us to this point, which have us crying out in pain and suffering and misery, asking for it all to stop, and not knowing that it can be brought to a stop within. People end up taking their bodies out of the picture, or doing terrible things to other bodies, right? And so, which is all violence, and we could bring it all to a stop. It just perpetuates itself. You see, it's a virus. Trauma, which is violence, violence, which is trauma. Trauma is violence, violence is trauma. And it's a self-perpetuating mechanism, just like that's how it transfers itself. It's a virus, and that's how it moves through the human mind field. And it can be brought to an end only by vigilance, that is, by paying attention to the nature of it, to the nature of trauma, to the nature of violence, the nature of thought, the nature of fear. And this can't be done without the willingness to pay total attention, which one cannot do unless one is willing to feel everything without running, without suppressing, without hiding, without numbing, using anything, whether you use thought patterns to run and hide and numb, or drugs, or the chasing of pleasure of any kind, it doesn't matter, or the chasing of pain, it doesn't matter. Any kind of movement that you generate toward or away from, it doesn't matter. That's all a kind of avoidance, suppression, denial, resistance. And so to simply be here and to feel everything without resisting, avoiding, moving away from, that's what it takes. And you have the capacity to feel everything. And you may think, well, I'll get overwhelmed. Well, maybe. But in the overwhelm, you see the overwhelm is only a struggle because there's still something being clung to in a particular way that you don't want to let go of. If you actually let go and let it do what it's going to do, it just washes over you. And the overwhelm is gone. It hypersaturates everything, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't feel like something's trying to fit in where it can't fit in, which is the result of you clinging to something to hold on to it in a particular form, shape, or position. Because you want to keep this down here while everything's trying to move around. This is trying to move too. Everything's trying to move. And so you stop trying to keep still what must move. You see? That's resistance. That's violence. That's warfare. What must move, must move. You stop trying to keep it still. And then you find out what is always still. And so this is meditation. Meditation is not trying to make your thoughts still. Thought is movement. You can't make it still. You let it move. You let it go. But you find out in allowing to move what naturally must move, you then find out what naturally is always still. By its own nature. Not you try to make it still. It's always still. Truth is still. Consciousness is still. It's stillness itself. And there's incredible dynamism in the stillness, incredible energy. And this begets all stuff, all movement. Everything that appears and disappears is born out of this incredible energy. And that energy itself is born, comes out of the stillness, the nothingness, which means no object. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in terms of psychological existence, but it is the basis of all of actual existence. And you can know it directly for yourself, and not as a theory or a philosophy or a speculation. And this is the only way out of the trap. You have to see it, perceive it, and know it directly as the truth of who and what you really are, which is exactly what you see when you come into contact with it. So, whoa, hey, I know you. And this is what we're here for. This is what we're here for. It puts everything right, and it shows you that even everything that's apparently wrong all needed to be and had to be in order for everything to come into accord with itself. The human being had to go through what the human being had to go through in order to learn about being and the nature of the form of the material world, of thought. Because if thought is not known, if one hasn't learned about thought, if one doesn't perceive thought actually the way it is, then it causes trouble. But when thought is perceived, seen, kept in vigilance, just as it is, not kept as in hold it down, but you stay vigilant. You just remain in vigilance. And if you slip from vigilance, that's okay. You just come back and you just keep looking. But when you look at thought, when you see it actually as it is, for what it is, without romanticizing it, without being superstitious about it, you just see it the way it is, then it can't hurt you. And it never really could hurt you anyway. It could only hurt itself. But you get confused into identifying with a bundle of thought, because thought can only touch thought. And if you identify with thought, when that thought gets hurt, you experience yourself as getting hurt. So our woes come from all of this false identification with thought and all the forms and structures of thought. And when you see that, you see, it's incredible. It's the most ingenious thing. And when you see it for what it is, and you therefore are no longer subject to being hurt by it, then you see what an incredible opportunity it is to play and to bring about well-being, or not bring about well-being, but to facilitate our survival, and there to be used as a tool for, yes, the facilitation of our physical survival and well-being on the planet. So it's meant to be used in service of being, in service of consciousness, in service of peace, in service of love, in service of truth, in service of joy, in service of ecstasy. And the moment it becomes used in service of maintaining the images that it has created for its false sense of security, socially and politically and so on, then it can only bring about warfare and violence and hatred and greed and despair and wrath and everything else that comes along with that. And all of that has a definite end. Only the intelligence of the consciousness itself, which is that open, eternal, vast, beginningless, endless space in which we are, in which everything is, which we are inseparable from, only that is real. Only that is eternal. Only that is worth knowing. And really that's all that can be known, actually. All other kinds of knowing are just temporary states of knowing, temporary knowledge. All knowledge made of thought and memory are all temporary. And they only are meant to serve an intermediary purpose in our apparent physical trajectory forward. And the minute we take the step, everything behind needs to go. The minute you take the next step, what's behind goes. The minute you take the next step, what's behind goes. And then it's recycled as raw material and used again to make the next, right? You see what I'm saying? You don't hold on to the form and try to drag it along with you. You take the step, you let it go. You take the step, you let it go. You take the step, you let it go. You take the step, you let it go, and on and on and on. And consciousness, the intelligence of what is, takes care of everything, of all the cycles that need to be cycling, apparently. Underneath the scene, underneath the it's all, if anything needs to be going, it'll be taken care of by consciousness itself. And so you see in this is really, we literally are in love. We're in love, literally. I mean that literally. We are in love. We are in peace. We are in truth. We are in ecstasy. And with the power of thought, we've painted everything bleak and grim and then believed it. And that's the trouble that we're in. We've been here for a long time. A long time. Thousands of years. Many, many tens of thousands. We've been here for a long time. And so the addiction is obvious, it's strong. But there's the possibility of being free. And the invitation is extended to any and all who would receive it. And this is where we are, and this is the way forward. Is in the way. I hope this has in some way been helpful. May you all know freedom and peace, joy, ecstasy, life, love. May you all know that you have every capacity, every possibility, and every power needed to face what is, to feel what is, to be with what is. May there be peace.